The smoke of a dying city choked the Mediterranean breeze. It was September, 480 years before the birth of Christ, and the ancient jewel of Attica was burning. From the rocky outcrop of the Acropolis, flames licked the sky, consuming the sacred olive wood and turning centuries of history into blackened ash. The Persian king Xerxes, commanding a war machine of unprecedented, mind-boggling scale, had marched across the Hellespont to exact a terrible vengeance. Below, huddled on the barren island of Salamis, the evacuated citizens of Athens watched their ancestral homes, their shrines, and their livelihoods dissolve into a horrifying inferno. While European nobles of later centuries would eat off wooden plates in drafty castles, these ancient refugees were already grappling with the highest concepts of liberty, civic duty, and human rights. They were not fighting for a king, they were fighting for an idea. From this catastrophic pile of ruins, from a city completely annihilated by an invincible foreign superpower, a miraculous resurrection was about to occur. In less than 50 years, this wasteland of charred stone would become the undisputed capital of human intellect, monumental art, and political freedom. It would produce structures so mathematically perfect, they still defy modern engineering, or for Muhammad a seeking swell, and a system of government that would literally rewrite the destiny of the human race. But what if I told you that this golden age, this sudden spectacular explosion of democratic genius, was not the organic, peaceful evolution of a unified society, not the calculated, ruthless, but brilliantly orchestrated masterwork of a single man? A man who manipulated the masses with the cold, unfeeling precision of a geometer, who built an unmatched empire on the crushed skulls and broken ships of his former allies, and who ultimately dragged his people into a war so devastating it would eventually destroy everything he had spent his life building. Before he was even born, his pregnant mother, Agariste, had a terrifying prophetic dream. She dreamt she was not giving birth to a human child, but to a roaring lion. What she brought into the world a few days later was a statesman so formidable, so intellectually intimidating, and politically untouchable, that his enemies and supporters alike would refer to him by a single, awe-inspiring title: the Olympian. This is the unbelievable, historically verified story of Pericles, the man who birthed the true Athenian democracy, Mancration democracy bus of Demoth the true Athenian, and the man whose fatal miscalculations almost wiped it from the face of the earth. But before we can understand the brilliant architect of the Golden Age, we must dig deep into the blood-soaked, treacherous soil from which he sprang. The real tragedy, however, was still hidden deep within the labyrinthine branches of his own cursed ancestry. Pericles was born into the Alcmaeonidae, a fiercely powerful aristocratic family that was simultaneously royalty and spiritually contaminated. Generations earlier, in the late 7th century BC, an ambitious aristocrat named Cylon had attempted a coup to become the tyrant of Athens. When his rebellion failed, his supporters sought sanctuary at the altar of the goddess Athena. The magistrate in charge, a man named Megacles, an ancestor of Pericles, promised them a fair trial if they surrendered. To ensure their safety, the rebels tied a long thread to the altar of the goddess, holding the other end as they descended from the Acropolis. But the thread snapped. Megacles, interpreting this as the goddess rejecting their supplication, ordered his men to slaughter the unarmed prisoners in cold blood. This monstrous sacrilege horrified the city. The entire Alcmaeonid family was cast out, branded with a hereditary spiritual pollution known as the curse of the Alcmaeonidae. This invisible stain would haunt Pericles for his entire life, providing his political enemies with a lethal weapon they would repeatedly try to use against him. Yet, this same family also produced Cleisthenes, the brilliant reformer, who in 508 BC had completely dismantled the old tribal loyalties of Athens, replacing them with a revolutionary system of geographical demes, effectively laying the groundwork for the world's first democracy. Pericles' father, Xanthippus, was a formidable military commander who had survived the ruthless political arena of Athens, even suffering ostracism, a brutal democratic mechanism where citizens scratched a politician's name onto a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon, to banish him from the city for 10 years. Xanthippus was recalled from exile when the Persian threat loomed, eventually commanding the Athenian fleet at the Battle of Mycale. Growing up in the shadow of such monumental figures, young Pericles inherited an explosive combination of immense wealth, radical democratic lineage, military pedigree, and the lingering shadow of ancestral guilt. But what the Athenian elite didn't realize was that they were incubating a prodigy who would soon eclipse them all. As a young boy, Pericles possessed a physical peculiarity that made him the relentless target of comic poets. His skull was unusually elongated, prompting playwrights to cruelly dub him Squillhead after a type of bulbous sea onion. To hide this, almost every surviving bust and statue of Pericles depicts him wearing a Corinthian helmet, pushed back perfectly over his forehead. But inside that uniquely shaped head resided a mind of terrifying analytical power. Unlike the boisterous, wine-drinking aristocrats of his generation, Pericles shunned the raucous symposia and elite dinner parties. He pursued an education that was breathtakingly avant-garde. He studied under Damon, an unparalleled master of musical theory, who secretly tutored Pericles in the ruthless mechanics of political strategy. He sparred verbally with Zeno of Elea, the philosopher who invented dialectic, teaching Pericles the devastating art of cross-examination, allowing him to corner his opponents and trap them in their own contradictory arguments. But the most profound influence on his life was Anaxagoras of Clazomene. Anaxagoras was a revolutionary thinker who shocked the deeply superstitious ancient world by declaring that the sun was not a fiery chariot driven by the god Apollo, but rather a massive, glowing rock larger than the entire Peloponnesian peninsula. He taught Pericles the concept of nous, a universal, rational mind that ordered the chaos of the cosmos. This radical scientific approach stripped away Pericles' fear of omens, eclipses, and divine wrath, replacing it with a cold, impenetrable rationality. There is a famous story that beautifully illustrates this dynamic. One day, a one-horned ram was brought to Pericles from his country estate. The prominent religious seer, Lampon, examined the deformed skull and dramatically prophesied that this single horn meant Pericles would vanquish his political rivals and become the sole, unquestioned ruler of Athens. The crowd gasped in awe. But Anaxagoras, standing nearby, simply asked for a knife. He carefully sliced open the ram's skull and demonstrated to the stunned onlookers that the animal's brain had merely failed to fill the cranial cavity, causing the horn to grow from the center of its forehead. It was a purely biological defect, not a divine message. Pericles absorbed this lesson entirely. He learned that true power did not come from fearing the gods. From fearing the gods, his the true power, but from understanding the mechanical reality of the world and the predictable psychology of human beings. But what they found next defied all logic, for this cold, calculating philosopher was about to become the most successful populist in human history. In 472 BC, a young Pericles made his first major public move. He stepped forward to act as the Choragos, the financial sponsor, for a radical new tragedy written by the legendary playwright Pericles. The play was called The Persians. Unlike traditional mythological stories, this play recounted the recent, visceral victory of the Athenian navy over the Persian fleet at Salamis. It was a massive financial gamble, but it was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. By funding a spectacle that celebrated the courage of the poor, rowing class of Athenians, the Thetes, Pericles permanently tethered his personal brand to the pride and glory of the common people. He recognized a shifting tectonic plate in Athenian society that the older aristocrats were completely blind to. The true power of Athens no longer lay in the armored hoplite infantry composed of wealthy landowners. It lay in the wooden benches of the triremes, the fast, deadly warships powered by thousands of impoverished rowers. Pericles understood that whoever controlled the navy controlled the empire, and whoever championed the rowers would rule Athens. At this time, the dominant political figure in Athens was Cimon, a dashing, immensely wealthy, and traditional military hero who favored strong diplomatic ties with the militaristic state of Sparta. Cimon was a populist of the old school. He left his sprawling orchards unfenced so the poor could pick his fruit. He distributed his own clothes to destitute citizens, and he threw lavish public banquets. Pericles, possessing a smaller personal fortune, realized he could never compete with Simon's private generosity. So he made a decision that would forever alter the mechanics of democracy. If he could not buy the people's love with his own money, he would buy it with the state's money. Just when victory seemed certain for the old guard, a single decision turned everything into a nightmare for the aristocracy. In 462 BC, alongside his political mentor Ephialtes, Pericles launched a devastating, lightning-fast legislative coup against the Areopagus, the ancient conservative council of ex-magistrates that held veto power over the democratic assembly. While Cimon was away leading an army to help the Spartans suppress a massive slave revolt, Pericles and Ephialtes passed a series of radical reforms that stripped the Areopagus of nearly all its powers, transferring supreme judicial and legislative authority directly to the Boulal, the Council of 500, and the Ecclesia, the popular assembly of all male citizens. It was a bloodless revolution. Outcomes of Defelv, Redorstrive Gondol Piep. But it ignited a fury among the elites that was anything but bloodless. Shortly after these reforms, Ephialtes was mysteriously assassinated in the dark alleys of Athens. The culprits were never officially caught, but the message was clear. Yet, this murder only cleared the path for Pericles. With Ephialtes dead and Cimon publicly humiliated and ostracized for his pro-Spartan sympathies, Pericles stood alone at the summit of Athenian politics. He immediately instituted the concept of misthos, or state pay for public service. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens were paid a daily wage simply to serve on juries in the massive law courts, the Hilaea, which sometimes comprised hundreds or thousands of jurors. To the conservatives, this was a catastrophic degeneration of civic duty, effectively turning justice into a paid gig for the lazy and destitute. But to the poor, it was true liberation. It meant a shoemaker or a potter could afford to leave his shop and participate in the governance of his city without his children starving. It was the absolute zenith of radical democracy bulmakros, without real life or mort, but it required an astronomical, unprecedented flow of cash to sustain. Where would this money come from? The answer lay in the darkest, most tyrannical chapter of the Athenian Golden Age. The real tragedy, however, was still hidden beneath the guise of a protective alliance. After the Persian invasions, Athens had organized a massive naval coalition known as the Delian League, named after the sacred island of Delos where the alliance's treasury was originally kept. The stated goal was simple: liberate the Greek cities of Ionia and protect the Aegean Sea from the Persian navy. Members of the League could either provide fully manned warships or, more conveniently, pay a tribute in silver talents directly to the League's treasury. Most smaller islands chose the latter, inadvertently handing Athens a massive, constantly expanding fleet. Slowly, invisibly, the Symmachia, the alliance of equals, morphed into an empire with Athens as its undisputed hegemon. In 454 BC, under the pretext of a rumored Persian naval threat, Pericles made his most audacious and controversial move. He ordered the entire treasury of the Delian League transferred from the neutral sanctuary of Delos directly to the Acropolis in Athens. This was a colossal sum of money, thousands of silver talents, the modern equivalent of billions of dollars. Once the silver was safely locked behind Athenian walls, the pretense of an equal alliance evaporated entirely. The tribute became a mandatory imperial tax, ruthlessly enforced by Athenian garrisons, known as clerices, stationed across the Aegean. When member states realized they had traded the Persian tyrant for an Athenian one and attempted to secede, Pericles crushed them with horrifying brutality. The islands of Naxos, Tharsos, and Euboea were systematically blockaded, starved out, and forced back into submission, their walls torn down and their fleets confiscated. The most chilling example of Pericles' cold-blooded imperialism occurred during the Samian War in 440 BC. Samos, a wealthy and powerful island, rebelled against Athenian interference. Pericles personally led a massive fleet of 60 ships to crush the uprising. When the Samians resisted, retreating behind their formidable city walls, Pericles did not engage in a traditional, honorable hoplite battle. Instead, he employed a terrifying new strategy. He brought in Artemon, a brilliant and eccentric engineer who invented revolutionary siege engines, including massive battering rams and protective sheds called tortoises. The siege dragged on for 9 brutal months, bleeding both sides dry. When Samos finally surrendered, Pericles' retribution was merciless. According to the historian Plutarch, who cites earlier sources, Pericles ordered the Samian captains and marines to be brought to the marketplace of Miletus. There, they were tied to boards and left exposed for 10 agonizing days. When they were half dead from exposure and thirst, Pericles ordered his men to beat their brains out with heavy clubs before casting their unburied bodies out to rot. It was a level of savagery that shocked the Greek world. Yet, when Pericles returned to Athens and delivered a magnificent funeral oration for the Athenian dead, the women of the city showered him with flowers and wreaths, treating him like a victorious god. But what if I told you that the very stones of the Parthenon were soaked in the blood of these innocent islanders? With the treasury completely under his control and the empire thoroughly subjugated, Pericles initiated the most spectacular and expensive public works program in human history. He argued that since Athens was providing military protection against Persia, the tribute money belonged entirely to Athens, to spend as she saw fit. He envisioned a city so visually overwhelmingly magnificent that its sheer architectural perfection would cement its supremacy for all time. At the center of this vision was the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the virgin warrior goddess. Under the direction of the brilliant architects Ictinus and Callicrates, and the master sculptor Phidias, an army of stonemasons, carpenters, sculptors, and laborers descended upon the Acropolis. They quarried over 20,000 tons of pure, luminous white Pentelic marble from the surrounding mountains, dragging the massive blocks up the steep incline of the Acropolis using complex systems of pulleys and wooden sledges. The mathematical precision of the Parthenon is so staggering, it still confounds modern architects. There is scarcely a single straight line in the entire building. Pericles and his architects understood the concept of optical illusion. They knew that a perfectly straight, massive column would appear to bow inward when viewed from below against the bright Mediterranean sky. To counteract this, they employed entasis, intentionally bulging the columns slightly in the middle and angling them inward so microscopically that if they were extended into the sky, they would eventually meet. The steps of the stylobate were subtly curved upward in the center to prevent them from looking like they sagged under the immense weight of the marble. Inside the inner sanctuary stood the piece de resistance, a colossal chryselephantine statue of Athena, designed by Phidias, standing nearly 40 feet tall. Her skin was crafted from pure, carved ivory, and her garments and armor were fashioned from solid gold plates, weighing over 40 talents, over a ton of pure gold. It was a mesmerizing, terrifying display of infinite wealth and divine favor. But this unprecedented extravagance did not go unchallenged. A formidable conservative politician named Thucydides, the son of Milesius, not to be confused with the famous historian, rose in the assembly to attack Pericles. He accused Pericles of bankrupting the state and bringing utter disgrace upon Athens by openly looting the allied treasury. He thundered that Athens looked like a vain, arrogant woman, decorating herself with stolen jewels and violently acquired gold. The assembly was deeply moved by this moral argument. Pericles, sensing he was losing the crowd, deployed a masterstroke of political theater. He stood up and calmly offered a devastating proposition. "Very well," Pericles said. "If you think it is too expensive, I will pay for the entire construction program out of my own pocket. But in return, I will engrave my own name, not the name of Athens, on every single building." The crowd erupted in a frenzy. Driven by immense civic pride and the absolute refusal to let one man claim the glory of the empire, the assembly overwhelmingly voted to continue funding the program with imperial money. Shortly after, in 443 BC, Pericles forced an ostracism vote. Thucydides, the son of Milesius, was banished from the city for 10 years. The last conservative opposition was shattered. For the next 14 years, Pericles would be elected annually to the position of strategophos, or general, ruling the chaotic, hyper-democratic assembly, not through force or through the sheer gravitational pull of his unmatched eloquence and intellect. He had achieved total, unassailable supremacy. Yet, beneath this flawless marble exterior, a rot was slowly taking hold, and the true tragedy of his life was about to unfold behind the closed doors of his own home. Despite his cold Olympian public persona, Pericles' personal life was a chaotic web of scandal and sorrow. He had legally divorced his aristocratic Athenian wife, with whom he had two legitimate sons, Xanthippus and Pericles. He then took up residence with a foreign woman who would become one of the most controversial and fascinating figures of antiquity, Aspasia of Miletus. Aspasia was not an Athenian citizen. She was a hetaira, a high-class courtesan. But more importantly, she possessed an intellect that rivaled, but perhaps even surpassed, that of Pericles himself. She turned Pericles' home into the intellectual epicenter of the ancient world. Philosophers, artists, and politicians flocked to her salon. Even the great Socrates would visit her to learn the arts of rhetoric and debate. Pericles was deeply, profoundly in love with her. It was said he kissed her affectionately every single morning when he left for the marketplace, and every evening when he returned, a public display of affection that deeply shocked the patriarchal, emotionally repressed aristocratic society of Athens. Because they could not attack Pericles directly in the assembly, his political enemies, demagogues, disgruntled aristocrats, and savage comic playwrights began a relentless, synchronized campaign to destroy his inner circle. They accused Aspasia of running a brothel and of manipulating Pericles into starting the Samian War to favor her home city of Miletus. They dragged her into court on charges of impiety, a crime punishable by death. In a shocking display of vulnerability, the great, impenetrable Pericles stood before the massive jury of his peers and wept openly, his tears streaming down his face as he desperately begged them to spare the life of the woman he loved. She was acquitted, but the attacks did not stop. They went after his mentor, Anaxagoras, charging the aging philosopher with impiety for teaching that the sun was a rock. Pericles could not save him from conviction, only managing to help him flee Athens in exile. They then targeted his closest friend, the master sculptor Phidias. They accused Phidias of stealing gold during the construction of the Athena statue. Phidias proved his innocence by removing the gold plates and having them weighed, exactly as Pericles had advised him to design them years earlier. Frustrated, his enemies then accused Phidias of the ultimate sacrilege, carving his own face and the face of Pericles onto the shield of the goddess Athena. For this, the brilliant artist who designed the visual soul of the Golden Age was thrown into a dark Athenian prison, where he died of sickness before his trial. Pericles was bleeding politically, isolated, and visibly aging, and it was precisely at this moment of supreme vulnerability that the fragile diplomatic web of the Greek world completely collapsed, plunging the entire Mediterranean into a catastrophic 30-year nightmare. The Peloponnesian War, the spark that ignited the powder keg, was complex, involving a labyrinthine series of alliances, revolts, and trade embargoes. Athens allied with Corcyra, a naval power that was in a bitter dispute with Corinth, a vital ally of Sparta. Furthermore, Pericles issued the Megarian Decree, a ruinous economic embargo that banned the merchants of Megara from trading in any port of the Athenian Empire. The Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, viewed this relentless, aggressive expansion of Athenian influence as an existential threat. They sent a chilling, final ultimatum to Athens: revoke the Megarian Decree and free the Greeks, or face total war. The Athenian assembly was terrified. The Spartan army was the most fearsome, highly trained infantry on earth. An invasion meant the systematic burning of the beautiful, fertile countryside of Attica, the destruction of ancient olive groves that took generations to grow, and the slaughter of anyone caught outside the walls. Many politicians pleaded for compromise, but Pericles stood firm. In a masterful, icy speech recorded by Thucydides the historian, Pericles argued that any concession, no matter how small, would merely be interpreted by Sparta as weakness, inviting further demands. "I see war approaching from the Peloponnese," he declared. He outlined a military strategy that was so counterintuitive, so radically psychologically demanding that only a man of his immense authority could have ever convinced a population to accept it. He proposed abandoning the entirety of the Attic countryside. The citizens would pack up their families, their furniture, and even the woodwork of their homes, and retreat entirely behind the massive, impregnable long walls, a heavily fortified corridor that connected the city of Athens directly to its port at the Piraeus. The Spartans, who had no expertise in siege warfare, would be left to furiously burn empty fields, while the Athenian navy, secure in its access to the sea, would import endless grain from the Black Sea and launch devastating coastal raids against the Peloponnese. It was a war of pure attrition, a mechanical, bloodless equation designed to break the Spartan will without risking a single hoplite in an open land battle. What the Spartans didn't realize, however, was that Pericles had anticipated their every move. In 431 BC, the mighty Spartan king Archidamus marched his terrifying phalanxes across the border into Attica. From the safety of the battlements, tens of thousands of crowded, displaced Athenian farmers watched in absolute agony as Spartan torches set fire to their ancestral homes, their precious vineyards, and their sacred shrines. The smoke blotted out the sun. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Furious young men, desperate to defend their honor, screamed for the gates to be opened. They formed mobs outside Pericles' house, cursing him as a coward and a traitor. But Pericles remained an immovable mountain of ice. Utilizing his ultimate constitutional authority as strategos, he absolutely refused to convene the assembly. He knew that if the people were allowed to vote in their current state of emotional hysteria, they would march out and be annihilated by the Spartan meat grinder. He single-handedly held the madness of an entire civilization in check through the sheer force of his tyrannical will. When the first year of the war ended, the Spartans withdrew and Pericles delivered what would become the most famous political speech in the history of Western civilization, the funeral oration. Standing in the Kerameikos cemetery, surrounded by the weeping widows and orphans of the first casualties, Pericles did not just mourn the dead, he constructed a towering philosophical monument to the idea of Athens itself. He drew a brilliant, stark contrast between the vibrant, intellectually free, open society of Athens and the rigid, culturally barren, militaristic slave camp of Sparta. He proclaimed that their constitution was called a democracy because power was in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. He argued that an Athenian citizen did not neglect the state to mind his own affairs, but rather, a man who took no interest in politics was not a man who minded his own business, but a man who had no business here at all. He famously declared that Athens was the school of Hellas, an education to all of Greece. The speech was a soaring, magnificent triumph, instantly unifying the city and filling the citizens with an intoxicating, invincible pride. But history has a way of punishing hubris, and the punishment that was coming for Athens would be absolute. Just when victory seemed certain, a single, microscopic biological disaster turned everything into an unimaginable nightmare. In the blistering summer of 430 BC, a highly contagious, horrifying disease arrived on the merchant ships, bringing grain from Egypt and Ethiopia. It struck the densely packed, sweltering refugee camps behind the long walls with the devastating force of a divine curse. It was the Plague of Athens. We still do not know exactly what pathogen caused it, typhus, smallpox, or a hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, but the account left by the historian Thucydides, who caught the disease and miraculously survived, is the stuff of absolute horror. Victims would suddenly be seized by a violent heat in the head, their eyes becoming red and inflamed. Their throats and tongues would bleed, emitting an unnatural, fetid breath. This was followed by violent coughing, retching, and convulsions. The skin would break out in reddish pustules and livid ulcers. But the most terrifying symptom was the unquenchable, maddening thirst. Victims felt as though they were burning from the inside out. They threw themselves naked into the public rain cisterns, desperately trying to cool the internal fire, contaminating the city's water supply in the process. The mortality rate was staggering, wiping out an estimated 1/3 of the entire population, including the heavy infantry and expert sailors. The social fabric of the great democracy completely disintegrated. Corpses piled up in the streets, left to rot under the blinding summer sun. Dogs and birds of prey that consumed the infected flesh died instantly, with death looming over everyone. All respect for the laws of men and gods vanished. Temples were packed with the dead and dying, who had crawled to the altars begging for salvation that never came. People began to spend their fortunes wildly, engaging in unprecedented debauchery, realizing they would not live long enough to face a trial or enjoy their savings. The profound rationality that Pericles had spent his life cultivating in his people was violently swept away by an overwhelming tide of primal, animal terror. The citizens of Athens, broken and desperate, turned their furious gaze upon the man who had locked them inside this diseased cage. They blamed Pericles for the war, for the plague, for their immense suffering. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the great Olympian was stripped of his generalship and slapped with a massive, humiliating financial fine. But the plague was not finished with him. It reached over the walls of his own home. It took his beloved sister. Then it struck down his eldest legitimate son, Xanthippus. Soon after, his second son, Pericles, also succumbed to the horrific disease. When Pericles, the man who had controlled his emotions with iron discipline for his entire life, stepped forward to place the funeral wreath upon the head of his dead son Pericles, the dam finally broke. The great statesman collapsed, wailing and sobbing uncontrollably, utterly destroyed by grief. The sight of the unbreakable man completely shattered finally moved the Athenian public to pity. They realized that no other leader possessed the intellect or the vision to guide them through the darkness. In a final, desperate act of contrition, they re-elected him as strategos, and even passed a special law granting citizenship to his illegitimate son with Aspasia, Pericles the Younger, so that his bloodline would not be entirely extinguished. But it was too late. In the autumn of 429 BC, the plague finally claimed the architect of the Golden Age. As Pericles lay dying in his bed, fading into the eternal dark, his surviving friends and political allies gathered around him. Thinking he was unconscious, they began to recount his magnificent achievements, his 9 massive military trophies, his stunning rhetorical victories, the vast wealth he had accumulated for the empire, and the immortal temples he had raised on the Acropolis. Suddenly, the dying man spoke, his voice a raspy whisper cutting through the oppressive silence of the sick room. He told them he was surprised they were praising him for achievements that relied so heavily on fortune, things that many other generals had also done. "You have forgotten to mention my greatest and most honorable glory," Pericles breathed. "No living Athenian ever put on mourning because of me." It was a final, profound testament to his restraint, a reminder that despite his immense power, he had never resorted to executing his political rivals, never acted as a true tyrant in a city that so easily could have fallen to one. With those final words, the Olympian passed away, and the brilliant, rational light of the Athenian Golden Age flickered and began to die. The power vacuum he left behind was immediately filled by ruthless, populist demagogues like Cleon, men who lacked Pericles' strategic foresight and moral restraint. They escalated the war, committing unspeakable atrocities, executing entire populations of revolting cities, and launching a disastrous, hubristic, utterly doomed armada to conquer the distant island of Sicily. Decades of relentless, brutal conflict eventually shattered the Athenian military completely. In 404 BC, the mighty city was finally starved into submission. The Spartan navy sailed into the Piraeus, and to the mocking sound of enemy flutes, the magnificent long walls were systematically torn down stone by stone. The empire was gone. The treasury was empty. The Golden Age was reduced to rubble. Yet, as we look back across the vast expanse of 2.5 millennia, staring at the ghostly white columns of the Parthenon, still standing stubbornly against the modern sky, we are forced to confront the deeply uncomfortable, endlessly fascinating paradox of this monumental statesman. He was a radical democrat who built a tyrannical empire, a rational philosopher who unleashed a devastating war, and a protector of the people who led them into an apocalyptic plague. He proved that democracy is capable of achieving the highest, most spectacular pinnacles of human civilization. but also that it is frighteningly susceptible to the seductive mechanical manipulations of a singular brilliant mind. In the end, the story of Pericles is not just a history of ancient politics. It is a profound, terrifying reflection on the nature of power itself, leaving us to wonder if the truest price of eternal architectural and intellectual glory is always, inevitably, paid in blood.